Engines of Destiny. The morning fog lifted slowly from Usedom Island on October 3, 1942, revealing a sight that would have confounded any casual observer. There, rising from a Baltic coastal marsh that had known only fishing boats and migrating cranes, stood a gleaming white rocket 46 feet tall. At precisely 2:04 p.m., with a roar that shattered the autumn silence, the missile climbed skyward, arced over the sea, and plunged earthward 118 miles away. History had pivoted on its axis. Today the spaceship was born, declared Walter Dornberger, the German Army's rocket chief, as he watched the vapor trail fade against October clouds. His words carried prophetic weight. But first, this child of science would serve darker masters. Peenemünde was born from defeat and nurtured by dreams of revenge. In the windswept isolation of Germany's northeast coast, where Baltic storms had long battered empty beaches, the Third Reich built its most audacious gamble. Here, brilliant minds pursued twin visions: one man's reach for the stars and one nation's grasp for salvation through terror. The site itself seemed chosen by Providence for secrets. Usedom's northern peninsula jutted into the Baltic like an accusing finger, separated from the mainland by treacherous channels and wrapped in morning mists that could hide a fleet. Local fishermen knew these waters as graveyard shallows. The Luftwaffe knew them as perfect cover. In 1936, Hermann Göring's aviation ministry quietly purchased this forgotten corner of Pomerania for 750,000 Reichsmarks. The transaction raised no eyebrows in Berlin's corridors. Why should it? Germany was forbidden rockets by Versailles. The purchase seemed merely another example of Nazi grandiosity, until construction crews arrived that autumn, working with suspicious urgency. What they built defied easy description: part university, part fortress, part factory of the future. Concrete bunkers sprouted among the pines, railroad tracks snaked toward the shore. A power plant rose to feed hungers yet unknown. By 1942, Peenemünde had become the largest rocket facility on Earth, employing 12,000 souls in pursuit of a weapon that existed only in imagination. At its heart stood Wernher von Braun, barely 30 but already possessed of the fierce ambition that marks true visionaries. Tall, handsome, and utterly convinced of his destiny, von Braun had sold his soul with startling efficiency. His passion lay among the stars. His paycheck came from the Wehrmacht. The arrangement troubled him less than it should have. Von Braun's rockets embodied a peculiar Nazi genius, the marriage of cutting-edge science to medieval brutality. While his engineers perfected guidance systems of breathtaking sophistication, slaves from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp died assembling the weapons by hand. Progress and barbarism shared the same assembly line. Such contradictions defined the Third Reich's approach to modernity. The V-2 itself was a masterpiece of deadly paradox. Powered by liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol, it could climb 60 miles high before plummeting toward its target at 3 times the speed of sound. No defense existed against its approach. No warning preceded its arrival. Yet for all its technological magnificence, the weapon remained stubbornly inaccurate, as likely to strike a hospital as an airfield. It embodied Hitler's preference for psychological warfare over military logic. British intelligence first glimpsed this threat through fragments and whispers. Polish resistance fighters smuggled out photographs. RAF reconnaissance flights captured suspicious construction. Slowly, piece by piece, Whitehall assembled a portrait of scientific horror brewing on the Baltic coast. The response was swift and merciless. Operation Hydra, launched on the night of August 17, 1943. 600 RAF bombers thundered through darkness toward Peenemünde, their bomb bays filled with high explosive and incendiary death. The raid killed 732 people, many of them foreign workers trapped in their barracks. It delayed V-2 production by precious months. Yet it could not kill an idea whose time had come. War's end scattered Peenemünde's secrets like dandelion seeds on changing winds. Von Braun and his inner circle fled west, carrying their knowledge toward American embrace. Soviet forces captured what remained, along with hundreds of lesser scientists and tons of documentation. From this division would spring the space race that defined the post-war world. The rockets that once terrorized London would eventually carry humans to the moon. The same equations that guided V2s towards civilian targets would navigate Apollo missions towards scientific triumph. Such transformations define the strange alchemy of technological progress, where yesterday's instruments of death become tomorrow's tools of discovery. Peenemünde endures as monument to science without conscience, brilliance without moral boundaries. Its story illuminates the eternal tension between human creativity and human cruelty, between the reach for transcendence and the grasp for power. The rockets have long since fallen silent, but their echo still resonates in every satellite that orbits overhead, every missile that stands ready in its silo. On Usedom Island today, only ruins mark where the future was born. Pine trees have reclaimed the launch pads, waves wash over the concrete foundations. Yet something persists in this haunted landscape, a reminder that the engines of destiny, once ignited by mortal ambition, burn with consequences no single generation can contain. The architecture of ambition. From the air, Peenemünde resembled a geometric disease spreading across Usedom's pristine landscape. What had once been unbroken forest and marsh now bore the harsh geometry of military purpose. Concrete rectangles, steel towers, and ruler-straight roads that carved the wilderness into functional segments. Yet this apparent chaos followed a deliberate logic, for Peenemünde was divided like ancient Gaul into two distinct realms, each serving different masters of the German war machine. The eastern sector, known simply as Peenemünde Ost, belonged to the army. Here, Walter Dornberger's Heeresversuchsanstalt held dominion over the future of warfare. The landscape bore witness to their obsession with vertical flight, towering test stands that pierced the sky like industrial cathedrals, their concrete shoulders designed to withstand forces that could shatter conventional buildings. This was rocket country, where the marriage of chemistry and ballistics would produce the V2. Westward lay Peenemünde West, the Luftwaffe's domain under the Erprobungsstelle. While their army colleagues reached for the stratosphere, the Air Force pursued more earthbound demons, the V1 flying bomb and other aerial weapons that would bring terror at subsonic speeds. The division was more than administrative convenience. It reflected the rigid compartmentalization that characterized German military culture, where each service guarded its secrets with jealous intensity. Yet geography demanded cooperation. Both sectors shared the island's electrical arteries, its transportation networks, and the elaborate security apparatus that kept prying eyes at bay. The arrangement resembled an uneasy marriage between competing siblings, forced to share the same house while pursuing rival dreams of destruction. At the heart of the army sector stood Proofstand 7th, the altar upon which rocket dreams were either sanctified or sacrificed. This test stand, rising from the sandy soil like a monument to controlled violence, would witness history's pivot point on October 3, 1942. Its concrete foundations, sunk deep enough to absorb the fury of liquid-fueled engines, supported a complex array of measurement devices, observation bunkers, and primitive television cameras that allowed engineers to witness their creation's brief, violent lives. The test stand was surrounded by its supporting congregation. Proofstände X and Ikans, smaller but equally essential platforms where components underwent individual trials before being assembled into complete weapons. Each morning brought new experiments, new failures, and occasional triumphs that sent plumes of vapor skyward like incense offerings to the gods of physics. Behind these dramatic stages lay the workshops and laboratories, where theory transformed into steel and chemistry. The Aerodynamic Institute housed a supersonic wind tunnel capable of generating Mach 4.4 airflows, allowing engineers to peer into the invisible forces that would guide their rockets through the thin air of the upper atmosphere. In these chambers, scale models endured artificial hurricanes, while instruments recorded every pressure variation, every moment of instability that might doom a full-sized weapon. Werk Ost and Werk Süd sprawled across the eastern sector like industrial organs pumping life into the rocket program. Werk Süd contained the crown jewel, Fertigungshalle 1, a cavernous assembly hall where V2 rockets took their final form. Here, in a space large enough to house a cathedral, skilled German technicians and enslaved foreign workers collaborated in the delicate art of mass-producing precision weapons. The hall's high windows filtered northern light across workbenches where the future was assembled one component at a time. Power for this mechanical symphony flowed from a coal-fired plant constructed by Siemens Schuckert AG near the Peenemünde Strait. The plant's massive smokestacks rose like exclamation points against the Baltic sky, proclaiming Germany's commitment to its rocket program. Coal barges navigated the treacherous channels to feed the plant's appetite, while cooling water drawn from the strait carried away the heat of industrial ambition. The human element of Peenemünde revealed the stark contradictions of Nazi society. German engineers and technicians enjoyed comfortable quarters that would not have been out of place at a university campus. Multi-story housing blocks provided private rooms, common areas, and amenities designed to keep valuable minds focused on their deadly work. The architecture spoke of a regime that understood the connection between creature comforts and creative output. Yet within sight of these privileged quarters stood the barbed wire enclosures of KZ Arbeitslager Karlshagen zur Wern, where forced laborers existed in conditions that mocked any pretense of human dignity. 5 prison barracks, surrounded by electrified wire and guard towers, housed the expendable workforce that Nazi ideology deemed unworthy of consideration. Here, in structures that barely qualified as shelter, lived the men and women whose labor made German rocket dreams possible. An intricate circulatory system of roads and railways connected these disparate elements into a functioning whole. The main road from the mainland crossed the Peenestrom via a bridge that became a critical vulnerability, for everything that entered or left Peenemünde passed through this single choke point. Railroad spurs branched like arteries throughout the complex, carrying coal to the power plant, components to assembly halls, and completed weapons to launch sites. A small airfield and several ports completed the transportation network, allowing the rapid movement of personnel and priority materials. These facilities also served intelligence purposes, for reconnaissance flights and covert communications required discrete entry and exit points that conventional transportation could not provide. Security enveloped the entire complex like an invisible membrane. Guard posts controlled every approach, while patrols moved constantly through the pine forests that still covered much of the island. Electronic surveillance, primitive by later standards but sophisticated for its time, monitored communications and movements. The security apparatus understood that Peenemünde's greatest vulnerability lay not in enemy bombs, but in enemy knowledge. From this carefully orchestrated infrastructure would emerge weapons that redefined the possible. The concrete and steel, the roads and railways, the laboratories and test stands, all were merely the skeleton upon which German ambition hung its hopes. Yet infrastructure alone could not guarantee success. That would require the convergence of scientific brilliance, industrial capacity, and the peculiar moral blindness that allowed civilized men to perfect instruments of indiscriminate death. The architects of Armageddon. In the summer of 1937, a peculiar assembly gathered in the pine-scented offices of Peenemunde's newly constructed headquarters. Around a conference table that would witness countless debates over the next 8 years, sat men who embodied the contradictions of their age, brilliant scientists serving a barbarous regime, visionaries who dreamed of stars while building instruments of earthly destruction. Their organizational chart would read like any modern corporation, but their purpose transcended conventional business. They were designing the future of warfare. At the head of this enterprise stood Major General Dr. Walter Dornberger, a man whose military bearing concealed the mind of an engineer. Tall, precise, and possessed of the bureaucratic cunning essential for survival in Nazi Germany, Dornberger understood that scientific innovation required political protection. His office walls bore the obligatory portrait of the Führer, but his true devotion lay with the rockets that promised to restore German military supremacy. Dornberger had learned hard lessons during the Great War, where Germany's technological advantages had been overwhelmed by Allied material superiority. Never again, he vowed, would German forces face such disadvantages. Rockets offered a path beyond conventional military thinking, weapons that could strike without warning across vast distances, immune to interception. Under his strategic oversight, Peenemünde would transform from experimental station to operational reality. Yet for all his authority, Dornberger recognized that rockets demanded expertise beyond military competence. That expertise belonged to a young man barely half his age, Dr. Wernher von Braun, whose technical directorship would define Peenemunde's scientific soul. Von Braun possessed the rare gift of making the impossible seem merely difficult. His ability to coordinate teams of specialists, mathematicians, metallurgists, electronics experts, and propulsion engineers bordered on the supernatural. Von Braun's leadership style blended Germanic efficiency with surprising informality. Engineers remember him striding through laboratories in civilian clothes, sleeves rolled up, sketching calculations on whatever surface presented itself. His enthusiasm was infectious, his confidence absolute. When lesser minds despaired over seemingly insurmountable technical challenges, von Braun would smile and suggest alternative approaches with the casual air of a chess master contemplating his next move. The relationship between Dornberger and von Braun exemplified the delicate balance between military necessity and scientific freedom that characterized Peenemunde's operation. Dornberger provided resources and protection from political interference. Von Braun delivered technological miracles. Neither man fully trusted the other, yet both understood their mutual dependence. The arrangement worked until it didn't. But that crisis lay years in the future. Supporting von Braun's vision was Dr. Walter Thiel, whose expertise in propulsion systems made him indispensable to the V2 program. Thiel approached rocket engines with the passion of an artist and the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. His innovations in fuel injection and combustion chamber design solved problems that had confounded engineers across Europe. Where others saw insurmountable thermodynamic challenges, Thiel perceived elegant solutions waiting to be discovered. Thiel's laboratory became a shrine to controlled combustion, where liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol merged in carefully calibrated violence. His test stands roared day and night, producing clouds of steam that drifted across Usedom like industrial ghosts. The work consumed him completely, perhaps too completely. On the night of August 17, 1943, when British bombers found Peenemünde in their crosshairs, Thiel was at home with his family, rather than in the protective bunkers near his laboratory. The raid claimed not only a brilliant engineer, but also his wife and children, a tragedy that haunted von Braun for the remainder of his life. Thiel's death elevated the importance of Dr. Ernst Steinhoff, whose guidance and control systems represented the intellectual summit of V2 technology. Steinhoff understood that rockets without accurate navigation were merely expensive fireworks. His team developed gyroscopic systems that could sense minute deviations from planned trajectories and correct them through precise adjustments to steering vanes in the rocket's exhaust stream. The mathematics involved strained contemporary computing capabilities, yet Steinhoff's engineers solved these equations using mechanical calculators and inspired intuition. The production challenges fell to Arthur Rudolph, a man whose engineering competence was matched only by his moral blindness. Rudolph transformed von Braun's prototypes into mass-produced weapons, establishing assembly lines that could produce dozens of V2s monthly. His methods were undeniably effective and utterly inhuman. At the Mittelwerk facility, which Rudolph later managed, forced laborers worked 18-hour shifts under conditions that killed thousands. Rudolph's post-war career in America ended when investigators finally examined his wartime activities too closely for comfort. The aerodynamic mysteries of supersonic flight belonged to Dr. Rudolf Hermann, whose wind tunnel facility at Peenemünde could simulate conditions no earthly aircraft had yet encountered. Hermann's team explored the invisible forces that would either stabilize or destroy rockets traveling faster than sound. Their research revealed the complex dance of pressure waves and boundary layers that govern hypersonic flight, knowledge that would prove invaluable not only for weapons, but eventually for spacecraft designed to escape Earth's gravitational embrace entirely. Klaus Riedel, veteran of the early rocket experiments that had preceded Peenemünde, headed the test laboratory where theory confronted reality on a daily basis. Riedel possessed the intuitive understanding of rockets that comes only from years of hands-on experience with explosive failure. His test stands witnessed countless disasters: engines that exploded on ignition, guidance systems that sent rockets spiraling into the Baltic, fuel pumps that failed at critical moments. Each failure taught lessons that brought the team closer to success. The organizational structure that supported these key figures resembled a technological symphony orchestra, with each section contributing essential expertise to the whole performance. Walter J. H. Papa, Riedel's Technical Design Office, translated concepts into detailed blueprints. Dr. Hermann Studing's Aeroballistics and Mathematics Laboratory provided the computational foundation for all flight planning. Dr. Mader's Materials Laboratory searched for alloys that could withstand the extreme temperatures and pressures of rocket operation. Helmut Gertrup served as Steinhoff's deputy in the crucial flight, guidance, and telemetering devices division, developing the electronic nervous system that would guide V-2s to their targets. Ludwig Roth's Future Projects Office peered beyond immediate military requirements toward possibilities that seemed pure science fiction. Intercontinental missiles, satellite launchers, and manned spacecraft that existed only in imagination, but would eventually reshape human civilization. The administrative machinery that sustained this scientific enterprise operated with typical German thoroughness. Mr. Genthy's purchasing office coordinated the acquisition of materials ranging from mundane steel tubing to exotic electronic components. Gerhard Reisig's measurements group collected and analyzed the vast quantities of data generated by each test flight. The personnel office, under Richard Sundermeyer, managed the complex logistics of housing and feeding 12,000 workers while maintaining the security protocols essential for protecting state secrets. Industrial collaboration extended Peenemunde's capabilities far beyond what any single facility could achieve. Siemens contributed electronic expertise that solved guidance problems. AEG provided power systems that could operate under extreme conditions. Academic institutions supplied both theoretical insights and trained personnel, creating a network of knowledge that spanned the German technical establishment. Yet beneath this impressive organizational achievement lay a moral cancer that corrupted everything it touched. The exploitation of forced labor from concentration camps transformed scientific progress into an instrument of genocide. Prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora endured conditions designed to extract maximum labor before inevitable death. The same hands that assembled precision instruments for space exploration also built weapons of terror using the blood of innocents. This contradiction defined Peenemunde's essential character, a place where humanity's highest aspirations encountered its darkest impulses. The organizational charts showed clean lines of authority and responsibility, but they could not capture the moral compromises that made the entire enterprise possible. In pursuing their vision of technological transcendence, the architects of Peenemunde became complicit in systems of oppression that stained their achievements with permanent guilt. The irony would become apparent only in hindsight. The same organizational methods that produced weapons of indiscriminate destruction would later enable peaceful exploration of the cosmos. The men who gathered around Dornberger's conference table were building more than rockets. They were constructing the institutional framework for humanity's expansion beyond Earth. Their legacy remains as complex as their motivations, as inspiring as it is troubling. Prometheus Bound. October 3, 1942, dawned grey and cold over Usedom Island, with Baltic winds carrying the scent of approaching winter. At precisely 2:04 p.m., history pivoted on a column of fire and steam. From Test Stand 7th, a sleek white missile designated A4 climbed skyward with the roar of controlled thunder, its exhaust trail scribing humanity's first tentative reach toward space. For 3.5 minutes, the rocket climbed through thinning air until it reached 84.5 kilometers above the Earth, officially crossing the boundary between atmosphere and void. Wernher von Braun watched from his observation bunker as telemetry confirmed what visual tracking suggested. The A4 had become the first artificial object to achieve spaceflight. Yet even as champagne corks popped in celebration, the rocket's true purpose cast shadows over this triumph. The same vehicle that had touched the edge of space would soon carry high explosive warheads across international borders. The age of ballistic warfare had begun. The path to this moment stretched back through years of frustration, failure, and incremental progress that tested the limits of human ingenuity. The A4, later renamed Vergeltungswaffe 2 or V2, embodied solutions to problems that had confounded engineers since rockets were first conceived. Chief among these challenges was the seemingly intractable issue of propulsion. Early rocket experiments had relied on solid fuels that burned unpredictably and produced insufficient thrust for long-range missions. The breakthrough came with liquid propellants, specifically a combination of ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen that could be precisely controlled and produced tremendous power. Walter Thiel's propulsion team had worked for 3 years to perfect the combustion chamber design, enduring explosions that scattered metal fragments across test stands and failures that sent rockets tumbling into the Baltic Sea. The solution required extraordinary precision in fuel injection timing, combustion chamber geometry, and cooling systems that could withstand temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius. When German engineers finally achieved stable combustion, they had created an engine producing 25 tons of thrust, more than enough to propel a 14-ton missile across 300 kilometers of airspace. Guidance presented equally formidable challenges. A rocket traveling at 4 times the speed of sound could not rely on external navigation aids. It required an internal sense of direction sophisticated enough to detect minute deviations from its intended trajectory. Ernst Steinhoff's team developed a gyroscopic system that combined mechanical stabilization with electronic computation, primitive by later standards but revolutionary for its time. The guidance package included 3 gyroscopes, an accelerometer, and an analog computer that processed flight data in real time. Control surfaces posed their own engineering puzzles. External rudders provided adequate steering at low speeds but became ineffective as the rocket accelerated beyond Mach 1. The solution lay in 4 graphite vanes positioned directly in the rocket's exhaust stream, where they could redirect thrust vectors even in the vacuum of space. These vanes had to withstand temperatures that would melt steel while maintaining precise positioning accuracy. The graphite material, sourced from pencil manufacturers, proved unexpectedly effective at surviving the inferno of rocket exhaust. The supersonic wind tunnel that Dr. Rudolf Hermann had constructed became essential for understanding the invisible forces that would either stabilize or destroy the A4 during its brief flight. The tunnel could simulate airflows up to Mach 4.4, allowing engineers to observe how shock waves formed around the rocket's nose cone and fins. These experiments revealed the critical importance of aerodynamic design in preventing the missile from tumbling out of control as it transitioned from subsonic to supersonic flight. Test Stand 7th served as the altar where theoretical calculations met practical reality. The concrete structure, designed to withstand repeated rocket launches, featured observation bunkers protected by thick walls and sophisticated instrumentation that recorded every aspect of engine performance. Early closed-circuit television cameras allowed engineers to observe launches from safe distances while collecting visual data that complemented electronic telemetry. The test stand became a theater of destruction where dozens of prototypes were sacrificed to perfect the design of operational weapons. The successful A4 test of October 1942 validated years of theoretical work, but it also marked the beginning of mass production efforts that would consume enormous resources and countless lives. Even as von Braun's team celebrated their technical triumph, Arthur Rudolph was establishing assembly lines where forced laborers would transform prototypes into weapons of war. Parallel development efforts at Peenemünde West focused on simpler but equally deadly weapons. The V-1 flying bomb, officially designated Fieseler F-103, represented a different approach to long-range warfare. Rather than reaching for space, the V-1 skimmed along at low altitude using a pulse jet engine that produced a distinctive buzzing sound. The weapon resembled a miniature aircraft more than a traditional rocket, with wings, a tail assembly, and an autopilot system that could navigate preset courses with reasonable accuracy. V-1 development proceeded more smoothly than the A4 program, largely because the technical challenges were less formidable. Pulse jet engines, while crude, were relatively simple to manufacture and maintain. The guidance system relied on mechanical computation rather than electronic sophistication, using a magnetic compass and predetermined flight time to reach target areas. The warhead, containing 850 kilograms of high explosive, could devastate entire city blocks when it impacted. Testing revealed the V1's capabilities and limitations with brutal clarity. The weapon could travel 250 kilometers at speeds approaching 640 kilometers per hour, making interception difficult but not impossible. Its low-altitude flight path made it vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes, yet its small size and speed provided protection against many defensive measures. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical damage, for the distinctive engine sound preceded impact by several seconds, long enough for listeners to experience terror, but too brief for effective response. The development of surface-to-air missiles represented Peenemunde's most desperate attempt to counter Allied air superiority. The Wasserfall project, initiated in 1943 as Allied bombing raids intensified, sought to create a guided interceptor capable of destroying high-altitude bombers. Based on scaled-down V2 technology, the Wasserfall utilized hypergolic propellants that ignited spontaneously when mixed, eliminating the complex ignition systems required for other rockets. Wasserfall's guidance system represented the pinnacle of German missile technology. Radio command guidance allowed ground controllers to steer the missile toward target aircraft using radar tracking and manual commands transmitted via radio link. The system required extraordinary coordination between radar operators, computer operators, and missile guidance specialists, a level of complexity that strained German technical capabilities even under ideal conditions. Additional surface-to-air projects proliferated as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. The Schmetterling missile employed a solid fuel booster combined with a liquid fuel sustainer, creating a two-stage weapon that could accelerate rapidly before transitioning to sustained flight. The Rheintochter utilized solid fuel throughout its flight profile, sacrificing sophistication for manufacturing simplicity. The Enzian resembled a manned fighter aircraft scaled down to missile proportions, while the Typhoon represented a return to unguided rockets that compensated for accuracy limitations through volume of fire. None of these defensive weapons achieved operational status before Germany's collapse, yet their development pushed technological boundaries that would influence post-war missile design. The research conducted at Peenemünde established fundamental principles of rocket guidance, propulsion, and aerodynamics that transcended their original military applications. The August 1943 RAF raid that devastated portions of Peenemünde marked a turning point in these development efforts. Operation Hydra's bombers killed over 700 people, including Walter Thiel and his family, while destroying critical facilities and forcing the relocation of key programs. The attack delayed V1 testing by 6 to 8 weeks and compelled the transfer of operations to alternative sites with inferior facilities. Yet the raid's impact extended beyond immediate damage. It demonstrated that even Germany's most secret weapons programs were vulnerable to Allied intelligence and military action. The psychological effect on Peenemunde's personnel was profound, for many had believed their remote location provided protection from the war's violence. The discovery that nowhere was truly safe added urgency to development efforts while undermining confidence in ultimate victory. The research and development activities at Peenemünde embodied the contradictions of technological progress under totalitarian rule. Brilliant innovations emerged from programs designed to perfect instruments of mass destruction. Scientists who dreamed of exploring the cosmos created weapons intended to terrorize civilian populations. The same mathematical equations that would eventually guide spacecraft to the moon first guided warheads toward enemy cities. These contradictions would haunt the survivors long after the war's end. Von Braun and his colleagues had opened doorways to the future while serving masters who represented humanity's darkest impulses. Their technical achievements remained untainted by political associations, yet their applications bore the mark of moral compromise that no subsequent accomplishments could fully erase. In pursuing the stars, they had first descended into hell. The price of progress. Dawn at Peenemünde arrived with different meanings for different men. For the German engineers and scientists who inhabited the comfortable residential blocks near the administrative center, It brought another day of challenging but rewarding work on humanity's most advanced technological project. For the prisoners confined behind the barbed wire of Karlshagen the Ferns, dawn meant survival, another 18 hours of backbreaking labor under the watchful eyes of SS guards who measured human worth in units of productivity. The contrast could hardly have been starker. Dr. Ernst Steinhoff might begin his morning with coffee and fresh bread in a heated dining hall, discussing guidance systems with colleagues who shared his passion for precision engineering. Meanwhile, barely a kilometer away, Jean Mineur, a Belgian resistance fighter captured in 1943, would awaken on a straw mattress in an unheated barracks, his breath visible in the cold air as he prepared for another day of moving concrete blocks and steel beams under the threat of immediate violence. This dual existence, brilliance alongside brutality, innovation funded by human suffering, defined Peenemunde's essential character more than any technical achievement. The rocket program's success depended not only on scientific genius, but also on a vast apparatus of coercion that transformed human beings into expendable resources. The moral implications of this arrangement would haunt the survivors long after the rocket stopped flying. Initially, Peenemunde's labor force consisted primarily of German technicians and skilled foreign workers who had volunteered for employment in exchange for decent wages and working conditions. These early workers constructed the basic infrastructure and established the initial production capabilities that made rocket development possible. Their experiences resembled those of employees at any major industrial facility, complete with recreational activities, medical care, and opportunities for advancement. The transformation began gradually as Germany's military situation deteriorated and labor shortages intensified. Foreign workers increasingly arrived under duress rather than voluntary contract. French technicians found themselves effectively prisoners, unable to leave despite completing their original assignments. Belgian engineers discovered that their temporary positions had become indefinite servitude. Dutch specialists learned that their expertise had made them too valuable to release. The August 1943 Allied bombing raid that devastated portions of Peenemünde marked a decisive turning point in the facility's labor practices. Operation Hydra killed over 700 people, including Walter Thiel and his family, while destroying critical production facilities and forcing a reassessment of security arrangements. The immediate response involved relocating key operations to dispersed sites less vulnerable to air attack. But the broader consequence was a dramatic escalation in the use of forced labor from concentration camps. Karlshagen Mai epitomized the transformed character of Peenemunde's workforce. The camp consisted of 5 wooden barracks surrounded by electrified barbed wire, guard towers, and bunkers that housed SS personnel responsible for maintaining discipline. Prisoners lived 20 to a room designed for 8, sleeping on straw mattresses infested with lice and rats. Sanitation facilities consisted of open latrines that bred disease and despair in equal measure. The daily routine began before dawn with a roll call that could last hours in any weather. Prisoners stood at attention while guards verified attendance and selected individuals for punishment based on infractions real or imagined. Breakfast consisted of ersatz coffee and a thin slice of bread, barely sufficient to sustain life, let alone hard physical labor. Work assignments ranged from construction projects to component assembly, with quotas that increased steadily regardless of prisoners' declining physical condition. Michael Thomas, a French prisoner who survived Karlshagen I, later described the psychological torture that accompanied physical hardship. Guards deliberately created impossible situations where prisoners faced punishment regardless of their choices. Complete a task too quickly and face accusations of sabotage, work too slowly, and endure beatings for laziness. The system was designed to break spirits as well as bodies, transforming proud individuals into hollow automatons focused solely on survival. The relocation of V2 production to the Mittelwerk facility near Nordhausen represented the nadir of Nazi labor exploitation. This underground complex, carved from the Harz Mountains by slave labor, became home to the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where conditions defied human endurance. Prisoners worked in tunnels where artificial lighting never fully dispelled the darkness, where the air reeked of explosives and human waste, where the sound of machinery never ceased. The statistics tell only part of the story. Between October 1943 and March 1944, approximately 2,900 of the 17,500 forced laborers at Dora died from overwork, malnutrition, disease, and outright murder. These numbers represent individual tragedies: fathers who would never see their children again, sons whose mothers waited in vain for news, brothers whose siblings mourned their loss for decades afterward. Yves Béon, a French déporté who worked in the Mittelwerk tunnels, described conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. Prisoners slept in the tunnels themselves, on bunks carved from rock walls that wept moisture continuously. The air was thick with dust from explosives production and granite particles that caused permanent lung damage. 12-hour shifts began and ended without sight of sunlight, creating a twilight existence where day and night lost all meaning. Yet even under these conditions, acts of resistance emerged that testified to the indomitable nature of human dignity. Prisoners engaged in deliberate sabotage, loosening bolts on rocket components, introducing foreign materials into fuel systems, and providing false information about production capabilities. These acts required extraordinary courage, for discovery meant immediate execution or transfer to extermination camps where survival was impossible. The French prisoner Robert Casabon organized a sabotage network that deliberately damaged electrical systems and contaminated fuel supplies. His group operated for months before German security forces infiltrated their organization, leading to mass arrests and executions. Casabon himself died under interrogation, but his network had succeeded in reducing rocket reliability by percentages that translated into saved lives in London and Antwerp. Soviet prisoners of war faced particular brutality due to Nazi racial ideology that classified Slavic peoples as subhuman. Ivan Stepanovich Seletsky, captured during the siege of Stalingrad, spent 18 months at Mittelwerk before liberation by American forces. His memoir describes systematic starvation, random violence, and medical experiments that violated every principle of human decency. Seletsky survived by maintaining mental connections to family members he would likely never see again, drawing strength from memories of better times and hope for eventual justice. The German scientists and engineers who worked alongside this apparatus of suffering displayed varying degrees of awareness and complicity. Some, like Wernher von Braun, later claimed ignorance of conditions in the labor camps, despite making frequent visits to production facilities where prisoner workers were clearly visible. Others, including Arthur Rudolph, actively participated in management decisions that prioritized production efficiency over human welfare. The evidence suggests that von Braun's claims of ignorance were disingenuous at best. Contemporary documents show him visiting Mittelwerk regularly and participating in discussions about labor allocation and productivity quotas. A 1944 letter from von Braun to Heinrich Himmler requests additional concentration camp prisoners for rocket production, indicating direct knowledge of and participation in the forced labor system. Rudolph's involvement was even more explicit. As production manager at Mittelwerk, he implemented policies that increased working hours, reduced food rations, and eliminated rest periods for sick prisoners. His efficiency reports to superiors in Berlin proudly documented productivity improvements achieved through what he euphemistically termed enhanced labor discipline. The moral complexity of these arrangements extended beyond individual culpability to encompass broader questions about scientific responsibility and the relationship between knowledge and power. The rockets that emerged from Mittelwerk represented genuine technological achievements that would eventually enable human spaceflight and satellite communication. Yet these accomplishments were purchased with blood and suffering on a scale that challenged any utilitarian calculus of costs and benefits. Some German scientists attempted to rationalize their participation by arguing that rocket technology would ultimately benefit humanity regardless of its immediate military applications. This perspective conveniently ignored the immediate human cost while projecting benefits that remained purely hypothetical. It also reflected a moral blindness that characterized much of Nazi society, the ability to compartmentalize evil while pursuing ostensibly noble goals. Liberation came suddenly for the survivors of Mittelwerk when American forces reached the Harz Mountains in April 1945. Soldiers who had witnessed the horrors of conventional warfare were nonetheless shocked by the conditions they discovered in the underground tunnels. The contrast between technological sophistication and human degradation seemed to epitomize the contradictions of Nazi civilization. The post-war reckoning with Peenemunde's legacy proved as complex as the moral questions it raised. Operation Paperclip brought key German scientists to the United States, where they contributed essential expertise to America's emerging space program. Von Braun became a national hero, celebrated for achievements that helped land Americans on the moon. Rudolph worked on the Saturn V rocket that powered Apollo missions before investigations into his wartime activities forced his departure from the country. The forced laborers who survived Peenemünde and Mittelwerk received no such recognition. Many returned to homelands that had been transformed by war and occupation. Others discovered that their families had perished in Nazi concentration camps or Soviet gulags. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars that lasted lifetimes, yet their suffering was largely forgotten as the world celebrated the technological achievements that their labor had made possible. The ethical questions raised by Peenemünde remain relevant in an era when scientific advancement continues to intersect with moral compromise. The development of autonomous weapons systems, artificial intelligence applications for military purposes, and surveillance technologies that threaten privacy all echo the fundamental dilemma faced by German scientists in the 1940s. Whether the pursuit of knowledge justifies collaboration with systems of oppression. The legacy of Peenemünde serves as a permanent reminder that technological progress is not morally neutral. Every innovation emerges from specific historical contexts that shape its development and applications. The rockets that touched the edge of space were also instruments of terror. The mathematical equations that enabled lunar exploration first guided warheads towards civilian targets. The same hands that assembled precision instruments for peaceful exploration also built weapons using the blood of innocents. In remembering Peenemünde, we honor not only the scientific achievements that expanded human capabilities, but also the human cost that made those achievements possible. The victims of Nazi forced labor deserve recognition as unwilling contributors to humanity's reach for the stars. Their suffering should inform contemporary debates about the responsibilities of scientists and the ethical boundaries that should constrain technological development. The price of progress, as Peenemünde demonstrated, can be measured not only in resources expended, but also in moral compromises accepted. That price proves far too high when it includes the systematic exploitation of human beings for the advancement of knowledge. The rockets may have reached space, but the souls of their creators remained earthbound, weighed down by choices that no subsequent achievement could fully redeem. The Shadow War. In the early hours of November 4, 1939, a thick manila envelope appeared on the desk of the British naval attaché in Oslo. The return address bore no name, only coordinates that led to an empty lot in Berlin. Inside, 7 pages of typed German text described weapons that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to contemporary warfare. Rockets that could cross the English Channel, guided bombs that could sink battleships, and radar systems more sophisticated than anything British scientists had imagined possible. The document became known as the Oslo Report, and its anonymous author was Hans Ferdinand Mayer, a German physicist whose conscience had overcome his patriotism. British intelligence initially dismissed the report as an elaborate deception. Its claims seemed too fantastic for credibility. Yet as war progressed and German technical capabilities became apparent, every prediction in Mayer's document proved accurate. The report had provided the Allies with their first glimpse into the secret world of Peenemünde, though they would not fully comprehend its significance for another 4 years. Mayer himself remained a mystery throughout the war. A respected scientist working within Germany's academic establishment, he had access to information that revealed the true scope of Nazi weapons development. His motivations for betraying state secrets remain unclear. Perhaps moral revulsion at weapons designed to terrorize civilians. Perhaps political opposition to Hitler's regime. Perhaps simple fear of what Germany's technological capabilities might unleash upon the world. Whatever drove him to that momentous decision, Meyer's report initiated an intelligence war that would ultimately determine the fate of London and the course of the broader conflict. German security arrangements at Peenemünde reflected both typical Nazi paranoia and genuine understanding of the facility's strategic importance. The complex operated under multiple layers of protection that began with geography. Usedom Island's remote location in the Baltic Sea created natural barriers against casual observation, while treacherous coastal waters discouraged unauthorized approaches by sea. The single bridge connecting Usedom to the mainland created a bottleneck where security forces could monitor every person and vehicle entering or leaving the facility. Administrative security relied on strict compartmentalization that limited each worker's knowledge to their specific responsibilities. Engineers designing guidance systems knew nothing about propulsion development. Technicians assembling rocket components received no information about targeting or deployment plans. Even senior scientists like von Braun operated within carefully defined boundaries that prevented any individual from comprehending the full scope of German weapons development. Physical security involved constant patrols by SS guards who had been selected for loyalty rather than intelligence. Watchtowers equipped with searchlights and machine guns overlooked the perimeter fences, while guard dogs roamed between multiple barrier lines during nighttime hours. The facility's communication systems operated on frequencies that changed daily according to codes distributed by courier rather than radio transmission. Yet for all these precautions, Peenemünde could not escape the attention of Allied intelligence agencies that had learned to interpret fragments of information with remarkable accuracy. The breakthrough came through aerial reconnaissance missions that revealed patterns of construction and activity inconsistent with conventional military installations. RAF pilots flying high-altitude photographic sorties over the Baltic region began capturing images of structures that defied easy explanation. Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill of the RAF's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit became the first Allied observer to recognize Peenemunde's true purpose. During a routine mission in May 1942, Hill photographed what appeared to be a large rocket standing vertically on a concrete platform. The image was so extraordinary that intelligence analysts initially dismissed it as a water tower or industrial chimney. Only when subsequent flights captured similar objects in different positions did the reality become undeniable. Germany was developing rockets larger than any weapon previously imagined. The Polish intelligence network provided crucial human intelligence that complemented aerial reconnaissance. Polish resistance fighters had established observation posts along the Baltic coast that monitored German activities on Usedom Island. These brave men and women, operating under constant threat of discovery and execution, transmitted coded reports describing the movement of unusual equipment and the presence of scientific personnel at what appeared to be a research facility. Jerzy Chmielewski, a Polish engineer who had been conscripted for construction work at Peenemünde, provided particularly valuable intelligence through messages smuggled to resistance contacts. Chmielewski's reports described rocket engines being tested, guidance systems being calibrated, and production facilities being expanded with obvious urgency. His information helped British analysts understand that Peenemünde represented more than experimental research. It was becoming an operational weapons facility. The intelligence picture gradually clarified through painstaking analysis at Bletchley Park, where codebreakers intercepted and decrypted German communications related to the rocket program. Enigma intercepts revealed codenames like Aggregate and Vergeltungswaffe that initially meant nothing to Allied analysts, but eventually provided crucial insights into German development priorities. Administrative messages about personnel transfers, equipment deliveries, and test schedules allowed intelligence officers to map the organizational structure and operational timeline of the rocket program. R.V. Jones, the brilliant scientist who headed British scientific intelligence, played a pivotal role in synthesizing these disparate information sources into a coherent assessment of the German threat. Jones possessed the rare combination of technical expertise and analytical insight necessary to distinguish genuine intelligence from deception operations. His reports to Churchill and the War Cabinet provided the foundation for Allied responses to German rocket development. The turning point came in June 1943 when reconnaissance photographs captured clear images of rockets being transported and positioned for launch tests. These images, combined with earlier intelligence reports, convinced British leadership that Germany possessed weapons capable of striking London from launch sites across the English Channel. The psychological impact of this realization was profound, for it suggested that Britain's island geography no longer provided protection from continental warfare. Churchill's response was characteristically decisive. If Germany could develop rockets that threatened London, then British bombers would eliminate the facilities where those rockets were produced. The result was Operation Hydra, the most ambitious precision bombing mission attempted by RAF Bomber Command to that point in the war. Planning for Operation Hydra began in July 1943 under the direction of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, whose strategic vision emphasized the destruction of German industrial capacity through sustained bombing campaigns. Yet Peenemünde presented unique challenges that required departure from conventional bombing doctrine. The facility's remote location meant that bombers would face extended flight times over enemy territory. Its technical importance demanded precision strikes against specific buildings rather than area bombardment of entire districts. The mission plan called for nearly 600 bombers attacking in 3 waves during the night of August 17–18, 1943. The first wave would target the housing estate where German scientists and engineers lived, attempting to eliminate key personnel through direct attack. The second wave would strike the production workshops where rockets were assembled and tested. The final wave would focus on the experimental facilities where future weapons were being developed. Master Bomber Group Captain John Searby led the formation through a night that would test every skill British aircrew had developed during 3 years of strategic bombing. The flight to Peenemünde required navigation across 600 miles of enemy territory, much of it over water where landmarks were scarce and defensive preparations were unknown. German radar tracked the incoming bombers from the moment they crossed the North Sea, yet controllers initially dismissed the formation as another raid against Berlin. This misidentification reflected a masterful deception operation that had convinced German air defenses to concentrate their fighter squadrons around the capital rather than the Baltic coast. British intelligence had transmitted false radio messages suggesting that Berlin was the primary target, while a smaller force of Mosquito bombers actually attacked the city to maintain the illusion. The deception succeeded completely, leaving Peenemünde virtually undefended during the critical hours of the attack. The bombing began at 11:47 p.m. with incendiary markers that illuminated target areas for the following waves. Explosive bombs weighing up to 4,000 pounds demolished buildings that had housed some of Germany's most advanced scientific research. The housing estate where Walter Thiel lived with his wife and children disappeared in a maelstrom of high explosive and fire. Production workshops that had assembled dozens of V-2 rockets collapsed under direct hits that buried sophisticated machinery beneath tons of concrete and steel. Yet the raid's most tragic victims were the forced laborers who had been locked in their barracks when air raid sirens sounded. SS guards had fled to protective bunkers, leaving prisoners to face the bombing without shelter or escape routes. Hundreds died in fires that consumed wooden buildings designed more for containment than habitation. Their deaths represented a final irony in lives already consumed by Nazi brutality, killed by the very forces attempting to liberate them from oppression. The immediate damage assessment revealed mixed results that would characterize strategic bombing throughout the war. Physical destruction was extensive but not decisive. Key buildings lay in ruins. Critical personnel had been killed or wounded, and production schedules faced significant delays. Yet the fundamental infrastructure of rocket development remained intact, along with most of the scientific knowledge necessary to continue the program. German responses to the raid demonstrated both the regime's paranoid security instincts and its remarkable capacity for industrial adaptation. Heinrich Himmler ordered immediate investigations to identify the intelligence sources that had enabled such precise targeting. Security protocols were revised to eliminate any possibility of further infiltration. Key personnel received new identities and relocated to dispersed facilities that would be harder to target and destroy. More significantly, rocket production was transferred to the underground Mittelwerk facility near Nordhausen, where slave labor would assemble V-2s in tunnels carved from solid rock. This relocation eliminated the vulnerability to air attack, while creating conditions of unimaginable horror for the prisoners forced to work in perpetual darkness beneath the earth. Operation Hydra marked the beginning of the broader Operation Crossbow campaign that targeted German rocket and flying bomb programs throughout 1943 and 1944. Allied bombers struck launch sites in France, production facilities in Germany, and transportation networks that carried weapons to operational areas. Fighter bombers hunted individual V-1 flying bombs during their flight toward London, while anti-aircraft guns created defensive barriers around likely target areas. The intelligence war continued even as the bombing campaign intensified. German security forces captured some Allied agents while missing others who continued transmitting valuable information about rocket deployments and technical developments. Polish resistance fighters maintained their observation posts despite increased German patrols and harsh reprisals against suspected collaborators. RAF reconnaissance flights continued photographing German facilities while adapting to enhanced defensive measures and improved camouflage techniques. The shadow war between Allied intelligence and German security ultimately demonstrated the limits of both secrecy and surveillance in modern warfare. No security system could completely conceal activities on the scale of Peenemunde's rocket development, just as no intelligence service could predict every aspect of enemy capabilities and intentions. Success came through patience, persistence, and the gradual accumulation of information that revealed patterns invisible in individual fragments. The human cost of this intelligence war extended far beyond the casualties of bombing raids and security sweeps. Resistance fighters faced torture and execution when captured by German security forces. Forced laborers who provided information to Allied agents risked immediate death if discovered. Even German scientists who harbored doubts about their work lived under constant surveillance that made any form of dissent extraordinarily dangerous. Yet the stakes justified these risks, for the weapons emerging from Peenemünde threatened to alter the fundamental balance of the war. Had German rocket development proceeded without interference, London might have faced bombardment that made the Blitz seem mild by comparison. The delay imposed by Allied bombing and the disruption caused by intelligence operations may have saved thousands of lives by limiting the V-weapon's operational effectiveness. The legacy of this shadow war extended far beyond 1945. The intelligence techniques developed to penetrate German secrecy became templates for Cold War espionage operations. The strategic bombing doctrine refined during Operation Hydra influenced nuclear targeting during the superpower confrontation. The marriage of technical intelligence and precision attack that characterized Operation Crossbow established precedents for contemporary counter-proliferation efforts. Most importantly, the intelligence war around Peenemünde demonstrated that technological secrets, however carefully guarded, eventually yield to persistent investigation by determined adversaries. The lesson remains relevant in an era when state and non-state actors pursue weapons of mass destruction while sophisticated intelligence agencies work to uncover and disrupt their efforts. The shadows cast by Usedom Island still fall across contemporary battlefields where information warfare determines the outcome of conflicts before conventional forces engage. Vengeance and Vindication. At 4:13 a.m. on September 8, 1944, Mrs. Ada Harrison was tending her small garden in Chiswick when the earth beneath her feet shuddered without warning. A tremendous explosion had occurred barely 3 streets away, leaving a crater 40 feet across and demolishing several houses completely. Yet no one had heard the whistle of falling bombs or the drone of aircraft engines. The first V-2 rocket to strike London had arrived faster than sound itself, inaugurating a new age of warfare where terror came without warning. The rocket that killed 3 civilians in Staveley Road represented the culmination of 8 years of development at Peenemünde, yet it also embodied the fundamental contradictions that characterized the entire German rocket program. Here was humanity's most sophisticated weapon, capable of touching the edge of space before plunging toward its target at 3 times the speed of sound. Yet for all its technological magnificence, the V-2 remained stubbornly inaccurate, as likely to strike a farm field as a military installation. It was the perfect symbol of Nazi Germany's approach to warfare. Brilliant innovation married to strategic incoherence. The V-1 flying bomb had preceded its ballistic cousin by nearly 3 months, making its operational debut during the early morning hours of June 13, 1944. The first salvo consisted of 10 weapons launched from sites along the French coast, though only 4 reached England and merely 1 struck London. The initial attacks seemed almost anticlimactic after years of German promises about wonder weapons that would reverse the tide of war. Yet the psychological impact of the V-1 proved far more significant than its physical damage. Londoners had grown accustomed to the rhythms of conventional air raids, where warning sirens provided precious minutes to seek shelter before bombers arrived overhead. The V-1 offered no such courtesy. Its distinctive pulse jet engine produced a puttering sound that Londoners quickly learned to dread, for when the engine stopped, the weapon would dive toward Earth in deadly silence. Churchill's government faced an agonizing decision about how to respond to this new threat. Revealing the true nature of the attacks might help civilians take appropriate precautions, but it would also provide German intelligence with valuable information about weapon accuracy and effectiveness. The compromise involved deliberately misleading press reports that suggested most flying bombs were falling short of their intended targets, encouraging German engineers to extend the weapon's range and thereby overshoot central London. The deception succeeded beyond all expectations. German technicians, believing their weapons were falling short, gradually increased fuel loads and extended flight times. The result was that V-1s began overshooting their primary targets and falling in relatively sparsely populated areas south of London. The manipulation saved countless civilian lives, while demonstrating the continuing importance of information warfare, even in the age of guided missiles. Defense against the V-1 evolved rapidly as British forces adapted to this unprecedented threat. Fighter pilots learned to intercept the slow-flying bombs during their approach to London, either shooting them down with cannon fire or using their aircraft's wingtips to flip the weapons off course. Anti-aircraft gunners repositioned their batteries along the coast to create defensive barriers that destroyed hundreds of flying bombs before they could reach populated areas. The most effective countermeasure proved to be the continued bombing of launch sites in France and Belgium. Operation Crossbow missions destroyed dozens of ski jump ramps from which V-1s were launched, forcing German engineers to develop mobile launchers that were harder to locate and attack. Yet these mobile systems proved less reliable and accurate than the fixed installations, further reducing the weapon's effectiveness. By the time V-1 attacks ended in March 1945, over 9,500 flying bombs had been launched against London and other Allied targets. Approximately 6,184 civilians died in these attacks, with another 17,000 wounded. The psychological toll was immeasurable, for the weapons created a climate of constant anxiety where ordinary activities became acts of courage. Yet for all their terror, the V-1s failed to achieve any strategic objective beyond the temporary disruption of civilian morale. The V-2 rocket presented even greater challenges for Allied defenses, precisely because no defense was possible. The weapon's hypersonic speed and vertical approach made interception impossible with 1940s technology. The only warning came from sonic booms that followed the impact explosion by several seconds, a cosmic joke that provided alerts for attacks that had already occurred. Between September 1944 and March 1945, approximately 3,000 V-2s were launched against Allied targets, with London and Antwerp bearing the brunt of the assault. The rockets killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and military personnel while destroying thousands of buildings and disrupting transportation networks crucial to the Allied advance into Germany. Yet like the V-1, the V-2 failed to influence the war's outcome in any meaningful way. The weapon's fundamental flaw was its inherent inaccuracy. A V-2 launched from the Netherlands might land anywhere within a circle several miles in diameter around its intended target. This dispersion pattern made the rockets useless against specific military objectives while ensuring that civilian casualties would be purely random. The result was terror without strategic purpose, exactly the kind of emotionally satisfying but militarily ineffective response that characterized much of Nazi strategic thinking. Individual V-2 attacks demonstrated both the weapon's devastating potential and its strategic irrelevance. On November 25, 1944, a rocket struck Woolworth's department store in New Cross, during Saturday afternoon shopping hours, killing 168 people and injuring hundreds more. The attack generated headlines around the world and created panic among London's civilian population. Yet it contributed nothing to Germany's military position and may have actually strengthened Allied resolve to continue the war until Nazi Germany was completely defeated. The most tragic V2 attack occurred on March 27, 1945, when a rocket struck a block of flats in Hughes Mansions, Stepney, killing 134 people, including many children. This attack came barely 6 weeks before Germany's surrender, when the war's outcome was no longer in doubt, and the rockets served no purpose beyond satisfying Hitler's desire for vengeance against civilian populations. The victims died for nothing more substantial than one man's rage at his approaching defeat. Belgian targets suffered equally from V2 attacks, particularly the port of Antwerp, which served as a crucial supply hub for Allied forces advancing into Germany. German commanders recognized that disrupting Allied logistics might slow the advance toward the Reich's heartland, making Antwerp a more militarily rational target than London. Yet even here, the rockets' inaccuracy undermined their effectiveness. Most V2s aimed at Antwerp's docks fell in residential neighborhoods or empty fields, killing civilians while leaving port facilities largely undamaged. The resources consumed by V-weapon production highlighted the program's strategic absurdity. Germany allocated materials and manpower sufficient to produce thousands of conventional aircraft or hundreds of tanks to weapons that killed fewer enemy personnel than a single infantry division might eliminate in a week of combat. The SS devoted massive resources to establishing and guarding the Mittelwerk facility, where V2s were assembled, resources that might have been used to defend against Allied bombing or to strengthen conventional military forces. More significantly, the rocket program diverted some of Germany's most talented scientists and engineers from projects that might have influenced the war's outcome. Had von Braun's team focused on jet aircraft development rather than ballistic missiles, Germany might have achieved air superiority that could have delayed or prevented Allied victory. The hypothetical possibilities are endless, but the historical reality is clear. Germany chose terror weapons over military effectiveness, exactly the kind of decision that ensured eventual defeat. The collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 initiated a scramble for German technology and personnel that would reshape the post-war world. Both the United States and Soviet Union recognized that German rocket expertise represented a crucial advantage in future conflicts, leading to competing operations designed to capture scientists, equipment, and knowledge before rival powers could acquire them. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists, began even before the war's end as Allied forces advanced into central Germany. Major Robert Staver of U.S. Army Ordnance led the initial effort to locate and secure key personnel from the Peenemünde program. His target list included nearly 500 names, with Wernher von Braun at the top of priorities. Von Braun's surrender to American forces on May 2, 1945, represented a triumph of personal calculation over national loyalty. As Soviet forces approached from the east and American forces from the west, von Braun had to choose which occupying power would offer the best prospects for continuing his work. His decision to flee westward and surrender to the Americans reflected both pragmatic assessment of comparative opportunities and ideological preference for Western democracy over Soviet communism. The initial American reception of German rocket scientists was complicated by competing priorities and moral considerations. Military officials recognized the immense value of German expertise in developing ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear weapons across intercontinental distances. Yet public opinion remained hostile toward any collaboration with former Nazi personnel, particularly given emerging revelations about the Holocaust and the use of slave labor in weapons production. The solution involved a careful public relations campaign that emphasized the scientists' potential contributions to peaceful space exploration while minimizing attention to their wartime activities. Von Braun was transformed from weapons designer to visionary of human spaceflight, a metamorphosis that required selective amnesia about his collaboration with SS officials and his knowledge of conditions at Mittelwerk. The transportation of German scientists to the United States began in September 1945 with the arrival of von Braun and 127 colleagues at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor. The group was then relocated to Fort Bliss in Texas, where they began working with American military officials on rocket development programs. Their initial reception was cordial but guarded, reflecting American uncertainty about how to integrate former enemies into sensitive military projects. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were conducting their own acquisition program in occupied Germany. Unlike the Americans, who relied primarily on voluntary recruitment, the Soviets simply transported entire facilities and workforce populations to the USSR without regard for individual preferences. This approach proved less effective in the long term, as coerced cooperation rarely produces the same results as voluntary collaboration. The Soviet capture of German rocket technology was extensive but ultimately incomplete. They acquired substantial quantities of V-2 components and manufacturing equipment, along with hundreds of German technicians and engineers. Yet they failed to secure the key personnel who possessed the most advanced knowledge, particularly the guidance and control specialists who had developed the systems that made accurate ballistic missiles possible. The competition between American and Soviet acquisition efforts reflected broader tensions that would define the Cold War. Each superpower recognized that rocket technology would determine military superiority in the nuclear age, making the capture of German expertise a national security priority that transcended conventional diplomatic considerations. The integration of German scientists into American rocket programs proceeded gradually as security investigations confirmed their value while minimizing political risks. Von Braun and his colleagues were initially restricted to supporting roles in existing projects, but their expertise soon made them indispensable to American efforts to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles and satellite launch capabilities. The transformation of Peenemunde's legacy from weapons of terror to instruments of exploration reached its culmination on July 16, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface. The Saturn V rocket that carried them there was a direct descendant of the V-2, designed by many of the same engineers who had worked in the pine forests of Usedom Island. The mathematical equations that guided Apollo missions were refined versions of calculations first performed in German laboratories during the war. Yet this technological triumph could not erase the moral complexities that surrounded the rocket program's origins. Von Braun's transformation into an American hero required a deliberate forgetting of the thousands who died assembling his rockets at Mittelwerk. The celebration of human achievement in space coincided with silence about human suffering in underground factories where that achievement was made possible. The legacy of Peenemünde thus encompasses both humanity's highest aspirations and its darkest impulses. The same technological innovations that enabled lunar exploration also made possible the terror bombing of civilian populations. The mathematical principles that guided spacecraft to distant planets first guided warheads toward enemy cities. The organizational methods that achieved one of science's greatest triumphs also facilitated systematic exploitation of forced labor. Contemporary debates about the ethics of scientific research and the responsibilities of scientists continue to grapple with questions first raised by the V-weapon program. The development of autonomous weapons systems, artificial intelligence applications for military purposes, and surveillance technologies that threaten privacy all echo the fundamental dilemma faced by German scientists during the war: whether the pursuit of knowledge justifies collaboration with systems of oppression. The rockets that rose from Peenemünde ultimately touched both the heavens and the depths of human experience. They demonstrated humanity's capacity for transcendence while revealing the moral compromises that can corrupt even the noblest aspirations. Their legacy serves as a permanent reminder that technological progress without moral foundation leads not to salvation but to damnation, no matter how spectacular the achievements might appear. In the end, Peenemunde's greatest impact may be its demonstration that the same human capabilities that reach for the stars can also plunge toward the abyss. The choice between these destinations depends not on technological sophistication, but on moral commitment. A lesson as relevant today as it was in the shadow of Hitler's collapsing Reich. The weight of memory. On a windswept morning in July 1969, as Neil Armstrong prepared to become the first human being to set foot on another world, an elderly man sat alone in his Alabama office, watching the television coverage with emotions too complex for simple joy. Wernher von Braun had achieved his childhood dream of reaching the moon, yet the triumph carried shadows that no amount of acclaim could dispel. The Saturn V rocket that powered Apollo 11 was the direct descendant of the V2 that had terrorized London 25 years earlier. The same mathematical equations that guided astronauts to peaceful exploration had first guided warheads toward civilian targets. This duality, scientific transcendence married to moral compromise, defines the essential legacy of Peenemünde. No assessment of the facility's historical significance can escape the fundamental contradiction at its heart. Humanity's greatest technological achievement emerging from one of its darkest moral failures. The rockets that opened the space age were built by slave labor. The scientists who enabled human spaceflight collaborated with a regime dedicated to human extermination. The knowledge that would eventually benefit all mankind was first applied to weapons designed to terrorize civilian populations. The technological contributions of Peenemünde extended far beyond the immediate impact of V-weapons during World War II. The innovations in liquid fuel propulsion, guidance systems, and aerodynamic design established fundamental principles that would govern rocket development for decades. Every satellite launched into orbit, every spacecraft dispatched to distant planets, every crew capsule that has carried astronauts into space has embodied engineering solutions first developed in the pine forests of Island. The V2's propulsion system represented a quantum leap in rocket technology that made all subsequent developments possible. The combustion chamber design, perfected by Walter Thiel's team, solved problems that had confounded engineers since Konstantin Tsiolkovsky first proposed liquid fuel rockets in the early 20th century. The precise fuel injection systems, the cooling mechanisms that prevented chamber walls from melting, the turbopump assemblies that delivered propellants at extraordinary pressures. All these innovations became standard components of modern rocket engines. Perhaps more significantly, the guidance and control systems developed by Ernst Steinhoff's team established the foundation for all subsequent efforts at precision spaceflight. The gyroscopic stabilization platform, the analog computer that processed flight data in real time, the servo mechanisms that translated electronic commands into physical steering movements. These components evolved directly into the sophisticated guidance systems that navigate contemporary spacecraft across the solar system. The aerodynamic research conducted in Peenemunde's supersonic wind tunnel provided crucial insights into the behavior of objects traveling faster than sound. This knowledge proved essential not only for ballistic missiles, but also for the hypersonic re-entry vehicles that would return astronauts safely from space. The heat shields that protected Apollo crews during their return from the moon were designed using principles first discovered during V2 development. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 initiated a technological diaspora that would reshape the post-war world. The competition between the United States and Soviet Union to acquire German rocket expertise represented more than simple intelligence gathering. It was a recognition that future military supremacy would depend on ballistic missile capabilities that only Peenemunde's veterans could provide. Operation Paperclip succeeded in recruiting the most valuable German scientists, but the moral complexities of this arrangement troubled many American officials. How could the United States, which had fought a war against fascism, suddenly embrace scientists who had collaborated with the Nazi regime? How could a democratic society benefit from knowledge acquired through slave labor and human suffering? The solution involved a careful reconstruction of memory that emphasized the scientists' potential contributions while minimizing attention to their wartime activities. Von Braun was transformed from weapons designer to visionary of peaceful space exploration. His colleagues were portrayed as reluctant participants in Nazi military programs rather than willing collaborators in systems of oppression. The narrative of redemption through space exploration gradually replaced the uncomfortable truth of complicity in war crimes. This transformation succeeded brilliantly in terms of public relations and technological achievement. Von Braun became one of America's most celebrated scientists, his vision of human spaceflight capturing the imagination of an entire generation. His appearances on television programs and in popular magazines helped build public support for the space program that would eventually land Americans on the Moon. The Saturn V rocket he designed remains one of the most successful launch vehicles ever built, with a perfect safety record across its operational lifetime. Yet the moral questions raised by Operation Paperclip never completely disappeared. Investigative journalists and historians continued examining the wartime activities of German scientists, revealing details that contradicted the sanitized narratives promoted by NASA and the military. Arthur Rudolph's departure from the United States in 1984, following investigations into his role at Mittelwerk, demonstrated that past actions eventually demand accountability, regardless of subsequent achievements. The Soviet acquisition of German rocket technology proceeded through different methods but encountered similar moral complexities. Rather than relying on voluntary recruitment, Soviet forces simply transported entire facilities and personnel to the USSR without regard for individual preferences. This approach proved less effective than American voluntary recruitment, as coerced cooperation rarely produces optimal results in advanced scientific research. The integration of German technology into Soviet missile programs nevertheless achieved remarkable success. The R-1 missile, a direct copy of the V-2, became the foundation for a ballistic missile force that would eventually enable Soviet nuclear parity with the United States. The R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik in 1957 incorporated design principles and technical solutions first developed at Peenemünde. The Soviet space program's early achievements, first satellite, first human in space, first spacecraft to reach another planet, all depended on knowledge originally acquired through Operation Osoaviakhim, the Soviet equivalent of Operation Paperclip. The success of both American and Soviet space programs created a peculiar situation where former enemies became inadvertent collaborators in humanity's expansion beyond Earth. German scientists working in Huntsville, Alabama, competed against their former colleagues now employed in Soviet design bureaus. Yet both groups were pursuing the same fundamental goal of human spaceflight using similar technical approaches developed during their wartime collaboration. This technological convergence reflected the universal nature of scientific principles that transcend political boundaries and ideological differences. The mathematical equations governing orbital mechanics work the same way regardless of whether they are applied by capitalist or communist engineers. The physical laws governing rocket propulsion operate identically whether discovered in democratic or totalitarian societies. Science itself remains morally neutral. Only its applications carry ethical implications. Contemporary assessments of Peenemunde's legacy must grapple with this fundamental tension between scientific achievement and moral responsibility. The Historical Technical Museum at Peenemünde represents one attempt to present a balanced narrative that acknowledges both the technological innovations and the human cost associated with the site's wartime activities. The museum's exhibits display V-2 components alongside testimonies from forced laborers, ensuring that visitors understand the complete context of rocket development. Yet even well-intentioned efforts at historical balance face inherent challenges in presenting narratives that satisfy both scientific and moral imperatives. How much attention should be devoted to technical achievements versus human suffering? How can museums celebrate genuine scientific progress while condemning the methods used to achieve it? How should educational institutions present the careers of scientists who made crucial contributions to human knowledge while collaborating with criminal regimes? Michael J. Neufeld's scholarly analysis of Peenemünde exemplifies the nuanced approach required for honest historical assessment. His research reveals the complex motivations and moral compromises of individual scientists, while placing their actions within broader historical contexts that explain without excusing their choices. Von Braun emerges from Neufeld's analysis neither as a pure villain nor as an innocent victim of circumstances, but as a complex human being whose ambitions and weaknesses led to both remarkable achievements and profound moral failures. This balanced perspective encourages critical examination of the relationship between scientific progress and political power that remains relevant in contemporary contexts. The development of artificial intelligence for military applications, the creation of surveillance technologies that threaten privacy, and the pursuit of biotechnology research with dual-use potential all raise questions similar to those faced by German scientists during the 1940s. Whether the pursuit of knowledge justifies collaboration with systems that may cause harm to human welfare. The space age inaugurated by Peenemunde's veterans has produced benefits that extend far beyond national prestige or military advantage. Satellite communications enable global connectivity that was unimaginable before the rocket age. Weather satellites provide early warning of natural disasters that save thousands of lives annually. Earth observation spacecraft monitor environmental changes that inform policy decisions affecting billions of people. Medical research conducted in microgravity has led to treatments for diseases that affect millions of patients worldwide. These peaceful applications of rocket technology represent the fulfillment of dreams that motivated scientists like von Braun long before they became involved in weapons development. The International Space Station, where astronauts from multiple nations collaborate on scientific research, embodies the internationalist vision that originally inspired rocket pioneers. The robotic spacecraft exploring Mars and the outer planets pursue knowledge for its own sake rather than military advantage. Yet even these peaceful achievements cannot fully separate the space age from its violent origins. Every rocket launch still employs principles first perfected for weapons delivery. Every satellite in orbit follows trajectories calculated using methods developed for ballistic missiles. Every spacecraft guidance system incorporates technologies originally designed to improve bombing accuracy. The peaceful conquest of space remains intimately connected to the violent conquest of Earth that made it possible. The moral legacy of Peenemünde thus extends beyond historical curiosity to encompass contemporary questions about the responsibilities of scientists and the ethical boundaries that should constrain technological development. The facility's history demonstrates both the tremendous potential and the enormous dangers inherent in scientific research conducted without adequate moral supervision. The thousands of forced laborers who died building V-2 rockets deserve recognition not only as victims of Nazi brutality, but also as unwilling contributors to humanity's expansion into space. Their suffering was not redeemed by subsequent achievements, but neither should their sacrifice be forgotten in celebrating technological progress. The rockets that eventually carried humans to the moon were built with their blood, and that fact must remain part of any honest assessment of the space age's origins. The scientists who worked at Peenemünde faced choices that seem clear in retrospect, but were undoubtedly complex at the time. The pressure to advance their careers, the desire to pursue scientific knowledge, the fear of political persecution, and the hope that their work might somehow benefit humanity all influenced decisions that had profound consequences. Their legacy serves as a reminder that individual choices matter, even within systems that seem to offer no good alternatives. The institutional legacy of Peenemünde continues to influence contemporary space agencies and research organizations that trace their origins to post-war recruitment of German scientists. NASA's culture of technical excellence and systematic engineering reflects methodologies first developed during the V-2 program. The rigorous testing procedures, the careful documentation of failures, and the incremental approach to technical innovation all echo practices established in the pine forests of Usedom Island. Yet these organizations have also learned from Peenemunde's moral failures. Contemporary space agencies operate under democratic oversight that would have been impossible in Nazi Germany. International cooperation has replaced national competition as the dominant paradigm for major space projects. The peaceful purposes that now govern most space activities represent a conscious rejection of the military origins that made such activities possible. The ultimate assessment of Peenemunde's legacy must acknowledge both its technological achievements and its moral failures without allowing either to overwhelm the other. The facility represents humanity at both its best and worst, capable of transcendent achievements that expand the boundaries of knowledge and experience, yet equally capable of organizing those achievements around systems of oppression and violence that diminish human dignity. This duality reflects broader patterns in human history, where progress and regression, enlightenment and barbarism, aspiration and exploitation coexist within the same societies and sometimes within the same individuals. Peenemünde serves as a permanent reminder that technological capability without moral foundation leads not to salvation but to catastrophe, regardless of how spectacular the immediate achievements might appear. The rockets that rose from Euston Island ultimately touched both heaven and hell, carrying humanity's hopes toward the stars while dragging its capacity for cruelty across the earth. Their legacy challenges every subsequent generation to pursue knowledge and progress without abandoning the moral principles that distinguish civilization from barbarism. In remembering Peenemünde, we honor both the victims of its crimes and the beneficiaries of its achievements, ensuring that future generations understand the full cost of reaching beyond the bonds of Earth.